Welcome back to an exciting two-part series of Instant Insights, bringing you our key takeaways from the Energy, Fuels and Decarbonisation Expo in Birmingham last week. In this episode, I'll be sharing my interview with Simon Mundy, the influential journalist from the Financial Times and author of Race for Tomorrow, where we discuss the future of ESG for businesses and the importance of policy in driving corporate change. This interview was recorded live at the conference.
So I work as part of the Thematic intelligence team, and we're looking at trying to explain big topics to businesses and help them understand them. So you were talking about enormous opportunities for people who took the risk and actually tried to make changes towards sustainable options. What would be your advice from everything you've seen to businesses wanting to take the step?
Yeah, I think it's been frustrating at times for me in conversations with business people to see the rather cautious and incremental approach that's often taken. And to some extent that comes down to the incentives that certain people in business are perceiving, I think. If you have a big legacy business, to some extent you're going to have an incentive to keep on milking profits out of that. We're seeing that in the oil and gas industry, for example. So Bernard Looney, for example, who has just announced his resignation. I don't know the details of how that happened, but it's notable that he was receiving a lot of resistance from various stakeholders to his efforts to push BP in a greener direction. So I think one has to be realistic, depending on what sort of business you're running, about the opposition that you might face when it comes to pushing in a greener direction. But the bottom line is that this is the direction of travel of the global economy. So in the short term, yes, a company like BP will be able to make significant amounts of money by selling oil and gas. But in the future, with tighter carbon pricing regimes, with an accelerating shift to cleaner forms of energy, that economic model, its days are clearly numbered. So it's a question really of how long-term your horizon is. If you're just thinking about the next quarter's profits, then fine, do business as usual. But if you're not, if you're trying to build a business that's going to last for many years to come, that's going to flourish, that's going to be able to ride the waves of the momentum in the global economy, then you'd be crazy to stick to business as usual. And I think something which some business people need to wake up to is the scale of the transformation that's happening. So as I said in my talk earlier, we have been living in the fossil fuel age since the 1700s. And for most of human history, global growth was close to zero. It was minimal growth. You know, a peasant in 1500 had basically the same lifestyle as a peasant in 1200. Since the Industrial Revolution, obviously global population has exploded, global living standards have exploded, global life expectancy, and all of this has been built upon a fossil fuel foundation. It's been by far the most transformational period of human history, and we have now realized that we need to bring the fossil fuel age to an end as quickly as possible because it's cooking the planet. This is literally one of the biggest things that's happened in the history of Homo sapiens. That is no exaggeration. And so in that context, it's quite amazing to me to see how boring some of the responses are of some businesses, this sort of very incremental approach. Because this is an absolutely massive event in the history of our civilization. And I think the companies that really recognize that and take a really disruptive approach are going to be the ones that win. And I have to say, I think the companies that I'm never bored by are the ones that are purely going after these opportunities. So there are more and more of them, of course. Companies whose whole business model is geared around the clean energy opportunity, the low carbon opportunity. And it strikes me that the companies who really go for that, and by the way, they don't have to be startups. So you have companies like Ørsted and Neste in Scandinavia who were fossil fuel companies first and foremost, and they pivoted. There's the option for companies to do that. But companies that really focus on that and don't get distracted by polluting legacy businesses, I think those are going to be the ones to be most excited about.
So I think part of this is that really this is the next stage of the Industrial Revolution. This energy revolution is what we're facing. And would you say that it was shareholder pressure that really is what's needed here to then drive the change? Or do you think it's internal company? Where do you think the biggest force will come from?
I think it only really happens with government action.
Okay.
And government action only really happens with widespread popular support. So something that concerns me is that this narrative has taken hold that the best thing that every individual can do is to minimize their carbon footprint. That doesn't sound right to me, because if we all just try to minimize our carbon footprint, unless we all kill ourselves, we're all going to have a carbon footprint still. That's not enough to get emissions down to zero under the current economic model that we live in. So we're still heading for a brick wall, but just at 50 miles an hour rather than 60 miles an hour. You know, it's still a disaster. The only way that things really change is through an updating of the rules of the modern economy. Through things like a carbon price, through updated environmental regulation. You need to shift the incentives for businesses. Because like I was saying, for the big incumbent businesses, they don't have sufficient incentive to do what's needed under the current regime. As I was saying in my talk, Shell can pollute for free.
Yes.
They don't have an economic incentive to stop producing enormous amounts of oil and gas. They would with a sufficiently high carbon price.
So do you think that the European carbon border mechanism is going to be a big change coming in then?
Yeah.
And a big impact for businesses?
Yeah, so that's one of the biggest things that's happened in the entire history of carbon pricing initiatives. I was in Singapore last week at an FT conference and hearing how Indian manufacturers who export to Europe are now racing to lock in renewable energy supplies so that they can sell to Europe on good terms without falling foul of the CBAM. So that's precisely how it's meant to work. Now, there are caveats there. There are being concerns raised that a lot of exporters from countries like India, which are developing countries with a high proportion of coal in their electricity mix, could be unfairly penalized by this system. So there could be problems around that. It has to be carefully designed to make sure it's not having unduly negative effects on low-income countries. But it strikes me that that is the approach that is going to work. There's this concept of the carbon club. So effectively, you're not going to have all the countries in the world agreeing at a COP to have a single carbon price. But what you might have is two jurisdictions, maybe the EU and the US, for example, setting the ball rolling and saying, okay, we're going to agree to this carbon price, this carbon tax, and we will impose tariffs on imports from countries that don't have the same approach. And then one by one, countries would have an incentive to adopt a similar policy. That's the best solution that I personally have seen so far, but I think we need to have something like it. And I think there is momentum growing around it. Last week at the African Climate Summit in Nairobi, African leaders issued a joint call for an international carbon price. Any economist for years would have told you that's the obvious solution. That is something which I'm encouraged by. I think more broadly, the focus has to be on changing the incentives that drive the economy. I think that can only happen through policy. And for that, I think individual people need to think of themselves a bit less as consumers. It does matter what consumer decisions you make, but I would say it's more important to think of yourself as a citizen. Because through our actions as citizens, voting obviously, but also through wider participation in the political process and popular discourse, that's how real change can get made.
Thank you very much. That was Simon Mundy, journalist at the Financial Times and author of Race Tomorrow.
Thank you.